Hello, everybody. What a wonderful crowd. Again, thank you for being here. What a pleasure this is every Wednesday. Today's speaker is Scott Williams. And Scott is going to discuss naval actions that took place on the James River near Richmond. His topics include the use of torpedoes by Confederate forces, the building of the Dutch Gap Canal, the Bermuda 100 campaign, and the attempt by the James River Squadron to break through federal obstructions and attack City Point late in the war. Scott's biographical information includes he is a geographic information systems analyst. I don't know what that is, but and I don't know. With Chesterfield County Environmental Engineering. He has worked for the county since 1996. During that time, he has been active in helping to preserve, interpret, and maintain Civil War sites in the county. He has created maps for several books, including the Bermuda 100 Campaign Tour Guide, the 7th South Carolina Cavalry to the Defense of Richmond and Our Brave Boys, a history of the 21st North Carolina Infantry. Scott has served as the chairman of the Military History Committee for the Chesterfield Historical Society since 2006. He's also on the board of the Richmond Battlefield Association and the Petersburg Battlefields Foundation. Scott is a 1986 graduate of Old Dominion University with a BA in geography. You are here and you will learn quite a bit today. So welcome, Scott Williams.
Okay, can y'all hear me okay with this mic? All right. GIS analyst is just a fancy term for a map maker. So that's what I do for the county. I started working for the county back in 1996, and some of you may know George Fickett. I worked with him in the GIS department in Richmond, in Chesterfield. And George had been doing work on the Bermuda 100 campaign for many years before I got to Chesterfield. I'd never heard of Bermuda 100, much less any Civil War action there. So with George, we started mapping out sites, and as the years went on, I learned more about the area and what happened there. Years ago, I came across a book called Capital Navy, which was written by John Koski, who worked for the Museum of the Confederacy. And that detailed some of the actions that took place on the James River, which was even more obscure than Bermuda 100. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. A buddy of mine, we've been doing tours on the river for about 10 years, mostly focusing on the area around Dutch Gap. I'm going to expand that a little bit today and just try to talk about some of the actions that took place on the river as a whole. So to start with, at the beginning of the war, the Confederacy has one problem with the James River is it's pretty much a straight shot right up to the Confederate capital in Richmond. At the very beginning of the war, down at Fort Monroe and Fort Wool, those remained in federal hands throughout the entire war. The Confederates did have some gun batteries trying to protect the river on Sewell's Point. They had Fort Boykin on the south side of the James, down near Smithfield, Fort Huger, Mulberry Island had some batteries there, had some batteries at Jamestown. Later, they had a battery at Fort Powhatan, which was a War of 1812 brick fort that the Confederates adapted, and nothing else from there pretty much up until Drury's Bluff, up about 8 miles south of Richmond. Later in the war, some of these things you see on the map, Fort Pocahontas, that's constructed by the Federals. Neat thing about a lot of these forts, a lot of them are still there. Fort Pocahontas is privately owned, but it's open by appointment, I believe, and they do a reenactment there every year. Jamestown, if you go out on the loop around Jamestown Island, and if you are real observant, kind of look off to the left in the woods, you'll see a big Confederate battery there. They don't interpret a lot of this stuff. Jamestown and Yorktown have a lot of Confederate earthworks in them, but they don't really interpret the Civil War that much. It's more the colonial theme. Fort Huger and Fort Boykin, those are both parks that you can get access to. Mulberry Island is Fort Eustis now, but even out on this tip, that fortress is still out there. So the first big event that I'm going to talk about that happened on the James River course, this is probably the most well-known event on the river, is this is where the era of the wooden ship comes to an end. On March 8th, 1862, when the CSS Virginia steams out into the mouth of the James and attacks 3 Union warships. So the Virginia sinks the Cumberland and the USS Congress. It runs the USS Minnesota aground. And on the March the 9th, it comes back to finish the job. But by then, the USS Monitor has arrived on the scene. So on the March 9th, 1862, we have the famous Battle of the Ironclads. They fight to a draw, but this, as I said, shows that this is the end of the wooden ship. We're now into the age of steel. So a great turn in naval history out on the James River. The Virginia stays back up in Norfolk and around the mouth of the James. It's a big deterrent. The Union Navy is not going to try to attempt to come up the river as long as that ship exists. What happens, however, in May of 1862, when the Peninsula Campaign begins, the Confederates abandon the peninsula, those forts along the river, and they abandon the CSS Virginia. It's thought that the Virginia would not be able to get past Jamestown. It drew too much water. So they towed it off of Craney Island and blew it up in the James. So as the Federals advanced up the peninsula, that leaves the entire James River is now open for the Federals to advance. And they don't waste any time getting to it. Virginia is destroyed on May 11th. By May 15th, there's a flotilla of Federal ships at Drury's Bluff approaching Richmond. And this may seem far-fetched, just a couple of ships, but this is how New Orleans fell early in the war. The Navy took New Orleans. The Army came in afterwards and occupied it. So they're hoping to do the same thing here. They're going to proceed up the James, be able to try to get to Richmond, bombard the city, and hopefully the city will surrender. The Army can follow. Making that trip were this odd-looking craft called the Naugatuck gunboat. That gun, I believe, would dip below decks and come back up for firing. A ship called the USS Aroostook. The most famous ship at this time, the USS Monitor. And this ship, the USS Galena. Now, the Monitor and the Galena are both ironclads. The Galena, of course, is a more traditional-looking ship, and you'll be able to see it on a later picture, but you notice this iron plating on the side of it. The school of thought was that you could take more of this traditional type ship and just iron plate it and have a very powerful warship. One other ship that came with them was a side wheel steamer called the USS Port Royal. So at the time, this is a Confederate map of Drury's Bluff later in the war. Drury's Bluff was still under construction when this battle took place. So more or less, it was about what you see there, kind of half the size of what we would see out there today. Probably one of the main deterrents was these obstructions, barges and rock cribs and other obstructions that they had sunk in the river to prevent that passage towards Richmond. So what happens in this battle is the flotilla approaches. They quickly realize that the Monitor is not of much use in this battle. Drury's Bluff, if you've ever been there, it sits about 90 feet up on the James River. It has this very commanding view of a long stretch of river. The Monitor's guns couldn't elevate high enough to shoot at the bluff. So the Galena is the one that really takes the fight to the fort. And just to get an idea, the Galena anchors up about 600 yards downstream. So that's a rough visual of how close quarters they would have been at Jury's Bluff. So there's a good close-up of that iron plating, and the highlight circles I'm popping up right now, those are the holes that got punched in the Galena from fire from up on Jury's Bluff. This kind of ironclad protection may be more effective against a ship at surface level. Certainly with the high angle and the projectiles coming down from above on Jury's Bluff, it was not very effective. The Galena ended up having 12 killed and 11 wounded. And there's descriptions of this gun deck on the boat looking like a slaughterhouse during this battle. If you can imagine projectiles cutting through that iron and timber and all those rivets becoming projectiles, splinters, it was a bad place to be if you were a gunner on the Galena. So one of the guns was disabled, and that man right there, Corporal John Mackey, he was a Marine on board the Galena. He took command of one of the guns and got his fellow Marines to get it back operational, and acted very heroically, and for his actions, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. And he is the first U.S. Marine to get that honor. It took place in Jury's Bluff on the James River. After a 3-hour battle, the Galena slips its anchors, goes back downstream, and that is the closest the U.S. Navy is going to get to Richmond for the entire war. In fact, when the Navy finally does land at the city of Richmond, it's Abraham Lincoln, and he's in a rowboat. When the war ended and Abe Lincoln wanted to visit Richmond, they begin with this, it's going to be this grand parade of ships escorting the president up to Richmond. Ships run aground, they hit Confederate blockades, or barriers in the river. Long story short, by the time Lincoln begins with this grand procession, he eventually ends up in a rowboat, and that's when he lands at the city of Richmond. So a really obscure event that not a lot of people know that happened around here was the Appomattox River Raid, June 26th and 27th of 1862. So I mentioned earlier about the Peninsula Campaign, and McClellan advances towards Richmond, Confederates fall back. Well, McClellan gets to the gates of Richmond by May 31st, and he proceeds to sit there for about a month, demanding more troops, constantly thinking that his army is undermanned, and the Confederates have more. Lincoln gets very impatient with them, and he personally orders the Navy to try to make an attack on the railroad that connects Petersburg to Richmond. Petersburg, of course, is a very important transportation hub during the Civil War. You have all these railroads coming into Petersburg, which is what's going to make it a target for Grant later. But you have one railroad that leaves Richmond, or leaves from Petersburg, and runs north to Richmond. Lincoln would like to see this bridge attacked so that it could help when McClellan ever does move. It could help prevent resupply and troops and other reinforcements coming up from the south. So the plan is for the Navy to take a pretty large group of ships, sail up the Appomattox River. They want to get near the mouth of Swift Creek, put men in boats, and then have them row up Swift Creek and destroy the railroad bridge. They had first attempted to hire some saboteurs to do this work. They were paid, and then they were never heard from again. So it was decided that the Navy would take on this task. Now, this was done rather hurriedly. The Navy commander didn't have a whole lot of intelligence on what the channels and what the area looked like. One of them described it as a river made for an ambush. This is a picture of one of the areas this raid took place in. That all bluff there is Point of Rocks Park today, but it's a very high bluff overlooking the river. At that time, at the time of the Civil War, there was a high rock outcropping there that overlooked the river. And just, I like this map of the channel. I mean, you can imagine being a ship captain trying to navigate that. It's a spider web of channels. It's very shallow. You have to hit the tides just right. But the president has ordered this, so the Navy's throwing everything they have at it. And as you can see, this little foray to Swift Creek that nobody's ever heard of has twice the number of ships involved that the attack on Richmond did. That one down the bottom right, the Island Belle, that ship's actually going to run aground and be abandoned. So that's going to be a loss in this attack. The one at the center there, the very bottom, the Alligator, that's kind of the one of the more interesting crafts in this attack. That is the United States Navy submarine. It was developed to remove obstructions. The way that it would work, there was a diving chamber in it, and supposedly a diver would be able to exit that contraption and place explosives on obstructions in the river and clear them out of the way. It was intended to be used in Charleston, but they brought it up here. And when you read some of the correspondences about this, if you ever look this up in the official records, they don't call it, they refer to it as the submarine propeller. And I remember reading some things, and I'm like, what in the world is this submarine propeller they keep talking about? Well, it was this thing. The man that was putting together this attempt to go up the Appomattox River, he receives this submarine and sent to him by the Secretary of the Navy. You can tell in the correspondences, he's like, I don't know what to do with this thing, but the brass in Washington has sent it to me. So he says a response basically saying that he's afraid if they use it and send it up the Appomattox, it could get caught, it could run aground, the Confederates could get their hands on it, and then it would be a threat to the entire Navy. So they leave it out in the Appomattox River. But the odd little footnote to history, this is the first combat deployment of a U.S. submarine. The Alligator, it meets the same fate as the Monitor. They were trying to take it to Charleston, and when they were towing it off of Cape Hatteras, they hit a storm, and the ship that was towing it feared that the Alligator was going to take them with it, so they cut it loose. And nobody knows what happened to it, but somewhere out there, this thing is sitting on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. So again, that's the river that they were going to attack. Stealth wasn't one of their strong points of this. You would think trying to get up the river at night in dark, put men in canoes to row up to a bridge, that they kind of want to do it quietly. But no, they entered this part of the Appomattox with guns blazing and all those ships shelling the bank. One of the men on board one of the Union vessels described the scene was one of terrible magnificence as the muzzle flashes lit the banks and the report rolled up and echoed back down the river. Startled by the concussion of the heavy guns, the dancing light of myriads of fireflies sparkled in strong relief against the black walls of the bluffs. The projectiles swept over the country like a hurricane. There were few who slumbered undisturbed on the line of the river this night. So as could be predicted, the shallowness of the channel, the unfamiliarity with the area, basically most of these ships at one time or another are hard aground. So for 2 days, a good chunk of the Union Navy in this area is grounded in the Appomattox River. At this time, there's battles going on across the river along the Chickahominy, so the Confederates aren't really focused on this action that much. But when you contemplate the possibility of 5 or 6 Union warships getting stuck in the Appomattox, what a catastrophe that would have been. So they abandoned this. They abandoned this effort, and years ago when I was giving this talk, one of my friends is a canoeist, and he said, "Well, have you ever been to the Swift Creek Bridge?" I said, "No," and he said, "Well, there's no way they could have ever rowed to it anyway. It's rocky, it's white water there." So again, a not very well thought out plan, but kind of one of the more interesting, obscure events of the war. So things are quiet on the river here for the most part for the next year. There are some federal patrols up the James River. They pretty much have free access to it. There's no real fortification stopping them other than up at Jury's Bluff. In 1864, the war comes back to this part of the world. Beginning in May of 1864, this is when Grant's going to begin his Grand Overland Campaign. He's going to attack on 3 different fronts here in Virginia. Sherman is going to start marching towards the sea down in the south. The idea is that he's going to hit the Confederacy on so many different fronts that reinforcements aren't going to be able to be transported from one area to the next. So here we have Grant crossing the Rapidan River. The Battle of the Wilderness begins. Out in the Shenandoah Valley, Franz Sigel starts going down the Shenandoah Valley. That ends at Newmarket with the famous battle there involving the VMI cadets. In this area, we've got Benjamin F. Butler coming up the James River with 38,000 men to land at City Point and Bermuda Hundred. So what Butler does, he sends troops up the York River towards West Point to try to fool the Confederates into thinking that he's going to follow the same route that McClellan did during the Peninsula Campaign. And Butler sails up, he stops at Wilson's Wharf and drops off troops there and at Fort Powhatan to secure his communication lines. And then he continues, there's a modern aerial view. Fort Powhatan, as I said, that's an old brick fort, that's still there. Wilson's Wharf is where Fort Pocahontas is, and that's all those earthworks are still there at that position. So when Butler gets to City Point, he drops off troops there, and then he lands most of his forces at Bermuda Hundred. And there's an engraving of what his invasion fleet looked like. He's got every make and model of ship, barge, ironclad, side wheeler, whatever you can think of, he had it and had troops in it. He lands at City Point. This is a picture later in the war when City Point, of course, is one of the busiest ports in the world. But it gives you a good idea of what it looked like when Butler landed here too. So he lands at City Point and Bermuda Hundred and advanced inland, and he starts digging in a line of earthworks there. And his objective is Richmond or Petersburg. And again, there's that same railroad that they were trying to get in 1862. Well, Butler's about 2 miles away from it with 38,000 men. And instead of aggressively moving towards Richmond or Petersburg, he kind of just sits there and waits for Grant to arrive. And that's a whole nother talk on the Bermuda Hundred campaign. But while he's moving out there, you can see he's surrounded on river on 3 sides by the river. So he's relying on the Navy to secure those flanks on the river. And what the Navy is concerned with are these 3 ships. These are up in Richmond. You have the CSS Virginia II, the Fredericksburg, and the Richmond. These are big, clunky, barely operable warships, but they're still a threat. They're still very powerful. So the Navy is very cautious about them being in the river, and they're also worried about these contraptions. Torpedoes, they called them. We would think of them today as underwater mines. But the Confederates had made a lot of research and effort into the development of this type of deterrent. They're at a big disadvantage with manpower and ship power, so they needed to draw on everything they could to try to defend the rivers. So they relied heavily on these mines, and there's a lot of spots in the river where there are these torpedo fields. One example from 1863, this ship, the Commodore Barney, made a foray up the James, near where Hatcher's Island is today. And one of these torpedoes exploded underneath of it, damaged the ship, but didn't sink it. But it illustrated the power of this weapon. So as I said, as the Navy is proceeding upriver, this is that right flank of Butler's Army. Those yellow lines are where the modern day cut-throughs are on the James River. At the time of the Civil War, it would have looked like that. You don't have those necks cut off. So it's a 8-mile trip around each one of those things as these ships are making their way upriver. As they round Curl's Neck and are coming up to Jones Neck, it's 3 Navy vessels, and they pick up a slave who informs them that up near Jones Neck there's one of these Confederate torpedo fields in the river. These were operated by the Confederate Submarine Battery Service. It was a very secretive group. Nobody knew where they had these things hidden along the river. So what happens is the Federals put a shore party ashore, and they begin scouring the banks looking for this torpedo hut. This is Deep Bottom Park in Henrico County. It's a boat ramp there today. And if you happen to ever go to Deep Bottom and you stand on that pier and look to your left, you'll see these little floats in the river that say no wake. Well, those floats are pretty close to where the Confederates had this torpedo hidden in the river. That star right there is where the control hut was. This particular torpedo was a large iron cask full of gunpowder. It had a cable connected to it. It had a battery system on the shore that it was connected to. So it was an electrically fired torpedo. An observer would be on the bank. They had stakes that they could sight with to kind of know where their torpedo was in the river. When a ship went over it, they made the electrical connection, and hopefully it would work. This is one of the ships that is in the foray. It was a ship called the Commodore Jones, and it ended up running over top of that mine. The Navy Yard up in Washington has a copy of it. That's what was in the James River. So the Commodore Jones goes over this torpedo, and when it was detonated, here's the description of it. It said, "She appeared to be lifted bodily, her wheels turning rapidly in midair. Persons declared they could see the green sedge of the banks beneath her keel. Then through her shot to a great height an immense fountain of water, followed by a denser column thick with mud. She absolutely crumbled to pieces, dissolved as it were in midair, enveloped by the falling spray, mud, water, and smoke. When the turbulence excited by the explosion subsided, not a vestige of the hull remained in sight, except small fragments of her frame, which came shooting to the surface." So that's one of the biggest losses of life on the James River during the war. That killed 49 sailors with that one explosion. So from that point forward, this is Harper's weekly illustration. I kind of see this is what haunts every Navy commander on the river for the rest of the war. The thought of torpedoes and the thought of those Confederate ironclads possibly lurking around the next bend. So at the beginning of the Bermuda Hundred campaign, as Butler moved out, on May the 6th, the Commodore Jones was sunk. The next day, another ship, the Shawsheen, is sunk down around Curl's Neck. And on May the 6th, as Union ships try to come up the Appomattox, another ship called the Brewster is lost. So in 3 days, they've lost 3 warships. So you can imagine the Navy is not going to be taking the lead going up the James anymore. It's going to wait for the Army to secure banks before the Navy moves forward. So fast forward now, as all of this is going on in Bermuda Hundred, one of the reasons the stuff that happened around here is so obscure in the history books is because Grant's Overland Campaign just overshadows it. While all these actions are going on down here on the river and around Bermuda Hundred, Grant's marching this bloody trail south. By June, he's at Petersburg. Confederate and Union forces suffer 90,000 casualties in a month by the time they make it to here. When Grant pulls out of Cold Harbor, he decides that he's going to cross the river and try to take Petersburg. He's changing his strategy now from destroying Lee's army in the field to trying to get to Petersburg to choke it out. One of the things he's going to depend on heavily are pontoon bridges. And the way engineers would assemble these, it's a series of boats, especially made for the purpose. They get these boats in position, they anchor them up, they lay planks across connecting the boats, then they lay a decking across those planks. And they just repeat that process on across the river. They have to anchor these, they have to contend with tides, they have to be able to open up sections of them to allow vessels to pass when needed. But these are going to be a key strategic asset for both Confederate and Union. The biggest one that Grant builds is down here again at Fort Powhatan, that yellow line there, that's at Wayanoke. He builds a pontoon bridge there to get his army from Cold Harbor to advance towards Petersburg. And I like to talk about this bridge for a number of reasons. Number one, it's the longest pontoon bridge that the U.S. Army ever built, still to this day. It's 2,170 feet long. It was 11 feet wide. They put it across that river in 7 hours. They had to have ships in place, anchored ships in the channel, to then anchor the pontoon bridge to. They had to be able to open that bridge up to allow ships to move through. And I'm going to read a description that was written by an engineer. This was a series of letters that he wrote home to his son. And it really gives a good visual of the size of Grant's army. Keep in mind that most of the troops that attacked Petersburg are ferried across the river on ships. What's crossing here is just supply trains. So this man writes, "This is the first time I've seen anything like an army cross a pontoon bridge, and I can assure you it's well worth seeing. From sunrise until midnight was one steady stream, tramp, tramp, and a roar like a railroad train all the time. At this time there seemed to be a break in the line, and innumerable steamers and other vessels having collected, they took out a portion of the bridge and allowed them to pass. On replacing the bridge, the tramp recommenced, and with occasionally a short break, the line lasted until I went to sleep. June 16th, he writes, still tramp, tramp, but getting more straggling. You must understand that only the artillery trains and supplies pass here. The main body of troops pass up the river on steamers and land at Bermuda 100. June 17th, third day of this, still tramp, tramp across the bridge. I went on shore this morning for a tramp myself, landed on the south side and walked towards Petersburg. I walked for 3 miles on either side as far as I could see. There was nothing but men, horses, and wagons. Until becoming tired of the scene, I turned back. On reaching the bridge, a scene presented itself that is hard to describe. The bridge and both sides of the river, as far as could be seen, was one continuous line of cavalry, which continued to cross the river for 2 hours, 4 abreast. Then another 2 hours of infantry, followed by innumerable hospital wagons and ambulances. During the afternoon, thousands of cattle passed over, which closed the grand cavalcade. This is probably the longest bridge that's ever been thrown across a river, and the greatest number of men, horses, cattle, and wagons that ever crossed one. Thousands of people would give a year of their lives just to say they had seen it." So as I said, pontoon bridges become a key thing for both armies. The Confederates had several upriver at Tree Hill, Warwick Bar, Drury's Bluff. This is where Lee's going to send his army across to when they pull out of Cold Harbor. The Federals in this area, they build pontoon bridges at Jones Landing, Deep Bottom, and 2 down here on the Appomattox at Point of Rocks and Broadway Landing. And fortunately, we have a lot of photographs of things that took place in this area. So this is the Jones Landing pontoon bridge. If any of y'all are familiar with the Meadowville Landing subdivision in Chesterfield, that's on this hill now. That's where the bridge crossed. They had a pontoon bridge here, and then later on they made this into a permanent structure, which was removed after the war, of course. Deep Bottom, where the boat landing is today, just upriver. another pontoon bridge location. They actually had several bridges at this site at different locations. And this is kind of a then and now sort of view. That cut down to the river where the bridge crossed is still there. And again, that's the boat landing right there, and that pontoon bridge crossed approximately in that spot right there. Broadway Landing down here on the Appomattox. Broadway Landing was the artillery depot for the Union Army during the siege of Petersburg. This is one of my favorite pictures because of this little black smudge down here. It's a dog. I think that's really cool that they were able to, well, number one, that he stood still long enough for that picture to be taken, but it just kind of adds that human element to it. So the next big thing is we move up the river, the Dutch Gap Canal, at what is Henricus Historical Park now. If you're standing there at the river today, you're looking at this broad swath of river that we refer to as Dutch Gap still. At the time of the Civil War, that was all one big connected piece of land. General Butler wanted to dig a canal there to bypass the guns at Battery Dantzler. This is a Confederate gun position that's been constructed on one of the bends of the river. As you can see by this picture, it's a very commanding view of the river, a stretch of river known as Trent's Reach. Way in the background there, federal gun positions were built on the river as a counter to Battery Dantzler. So Butler in August of 1864 starts digging the Dutch Gap Canal. It's a couple hundred feet long, about 40 feet wide is what the goal is here. He thinks he's going to dig it in a couple of weeks, but things change. The siege of Petersburg starts happening, and the canal is not finished until January of 1864. But at the beginning, when they start to dig, this kind of gives you an example of the working conditions there. Confederates are shelling it. They've got mortar batteries set up nearby, so they're dropping shells into this thing while work is going on. So what the Union does, they dig these dugouts on the side, and the men would dig away. They'd have a spotter up on the hill. If he saw an artillery round that looked like it had the right trajectory that was going to land in the works there, he would give a shout, and everybody would drop their picks and shovels and go for these holes in the side. Not a very pleasant place to be working at. While that's underway, back down the river here at Hopewell, you had the City Point explosion on August 9, 1864. Up until this time, Union warships carrying ammunition barges, they would dock right along here at City Point. And on August 9th, a Confederate saboteur managed to sneak on board a box that he said was a delivery for the captain. I believe he said it was candles that were being delivered to him. And what was in there was basically a time bomb. And it worked, and this barge that he got it on board was full of small arms ammunition and black powder. And when it went up, it took out a large portion of the docks with a huge explosion at City Point. And it wasn't until after the war that the Union realized or found out that this was a intentional act. They thought that this was a accident of mishandling of explosives on the barge, and it changed the entire way they distributed ammo down here at City Point for the rest of the war. So back at Dutch Gap, as I said, it didn't open up until January 1st. They dug the canal, and they left everything dug out except that bulkhead at the end there. And on January 1st, what they had done, they dug a gallery where this wood-looking structure is. That was a gallery that went down, and underneath that bulkhead, and they packed it full of gunpowder, just like what they did at the crater here at Petersburg. And the idea was to blow that bulkhead up and then get in there with dredges and clear it out and have that canal open. When they gathered, They lit the fuse, waiting for this thing to explode, and then they realized that they had not recalled the guard that was on the other side of the wall. So this man down here in the bottom, Walter Thorne, he was a lieutenant for the 116th USCT. He ran out on the bulkhead and got those men back to safety at great peril to himself before the thing blew up. And for that, he also was awarded the Medal of Honor. He was awarded that in 1888. It blew up, the bulkhead went away, the canal filled back up with the dirt that fell down. As I said, the idea was to dredge it out, but by this time there's a change of command. The Navy really is not interested in having that Dutch Gap Canal open. It's right here. As I said, remember, it was supposed to take 2 weeks to dig to bypass this spot here. By the time they finish it, things have changed. There's already other Confederate gun batteries up here on the river. So cutting through there is less advantageous to the Union, and honestly, they're more afraid that the Confederates are going to use it now to come down river and attack them at City Point, because the Federals have built their own obstructions in the river right here. So that takes us into January of 1864, or I'm sorry, January of 65. This is when the Confederate ironclad fleet, who's been up in Richmond all this time, decides to finally try to break out and attack City Point. Now, for the previous year, they have come down river on occasion. They've been used more as floating artillery support. There have been some long-range duels with Federal gunboats down around Dutch Gap, shooting over land at each other. But there hasn't been any direct attack on Union forces. So there's a couple of things that came into play in January.
Excuse me, sir. I'm sorry for interrupting. Somebody's got a silver Malibu parked in front of the Harper thing, and you check it on the other side. Okay, thank you.
So January 15th, 1865, Federal forces are attacking Fort Fisher. Well, that affects us here at the James River because in order to do that, they pulled every Union warship, for the most part, out of the James, and they're now sitting down there off North Carolina. The only ship of any strength, I guess you could say, is a double-turreted ironclad called the Onondaga. There's a bigger gunboat, the Mahaska, and then a few smaller torpedo boats. Most of the Navy's gone out of the James River. Also, those obstructions that I showed a second ago, this is what they look like in 1865. That ship is supposed to be up there on line with this faint line you see in the river, which is a chain going across the river blocking it. It had been a really hard winter, a lot of snow, a lot of floods. These obstructions had been washed out. So the Confederates see the opportunity now to get these ironclads downriver and try to attack City Point and hopefully disrupt Grant's supply base. Now, this is the odds are long on this. They kind of like the Appomattox River raid. This is sort of put at the feet of the Confederate commander, a man named John Mitchell, and he's told to get this done. But it's not a simple fact of just starting up the boat and going downriver. He's got a lot to contend with. He's got these three very clunky ironclads. They're each going to have vessels lashed to their sides. They're going to do this at night so that they can't be spotted. And they've got to make their way down all those twisty turns in the river in darkness. Right here where this first star is, there's a Union gun battery there, Fort Brady. That's a National Park Service site now. They've got to get past that. They've got to get down here to Trent's Reach. They've got to get through the obstructions. They have to get past these Federal guns here. You've got the Onondaga downriver, and then they've got these bridges that are down here that they'd have to get through. And then they've got to make it all the way down here to City Point. There's a close-up of what Trent's Reach looked like at the time. It's a big, broad body of water. If you go out there today, Henricus Park is here. The Dutch Gap power plant is over here. This part of the river is all filled in now. It's a very wide body of water, but if you were to go over here, I bet you could walk from here to here, and it's still ankle deep. It's really, really shallow, and it was then. There's a very small channel that they would have to navigate. That's what it looks like today. Dutch Gap here, this is all the part that's filled in now. Henricus Historical Park is right there. That's the USS Onondaga. As I said, it's probably one of the most powerful warships in the world at this point with those two turrets. But it's the only thing in the river right now. And this is one of the pictures I like too, because you can see this detail. It was laundry day, apparently, on the ship, and that's all the crew's clothes hanging up. Along with the Onondaga, you had this odd-looking vessel. It was a torpedo boat called the Spootenduvel. So it's there in case these ironclads get through. It's supposed to run up to them and ram this torpedo into them and hopefully keep them from getting down the river. So on the night of January 24th, the Confederate fleet makes its way downriver. They get past all those obstructions. They get past Fort Brady. Fort Brady fires on them, but they're past them before they can. They can't turn their guns downriver to shoot at them once they're past. But what that did do is it alerted these guns down at Trent's Reach that something was afoot. Again, from the old map to the modern day, so we can see what it looks like now. Only one of these ships, the Fredericksburg, gets through the obstructions. In the dark of night, with small arms fire and artillery firing blindly at them, that ship is able to get through. They send a boat back with a message to the other vessels letting them know, we've broken through, come on. There they find out that the other vessels have all run aground, right at the hill right under where Battery Dantzler is. Needless to say, surprise being the biggest thing in their favor in this attack, they're going to lose that because these ships are stuck. They had a very narrow window of time to get through there depending on the tide, and now the tide is dropping and the majority of the fleet was stuck in that bend in the river. So the next morning when the sun comes up, these guns have a nice target of 2 Confederate ironclads and several smaller ships stuck in the mud in front of them. They open fire on them. One ship called the Drury, they hit that with their second shot. They hit its powder magazine and it blew up in the river. They said it was such a loud explosion that Grant heard it at City Point. They open fire on these other Confederate ironclads, do some damage to them. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the Onondaga finally makes its way back upriver, and for 45 minutes, it gets off some shots at these Confederate ironclads. When I started looking up this in more detail, and I looked up the records, you see the correspondence is flying. This was serious stuff. This had people at the highest level of the Navy in Washington, D.C. concerned. They were terrified that these ironclads were going to get down the river. And the whole time, they're sending messages to a man named William Parker, who's in command, who's on the Onondaga, wanting to know, what are you doing? How are you stopping these ironclads? We want you to ram them, sink half your vessels if need be. William Parker doesn't get back in touch with them. I mean, probably because he's on the ship in the middle of a river, trying to fight 3 Confederate ironclads. He does his best. He takes the ironclad back down river, thinking, okay, if they come down river, I'm going to take them on here. Much to his surprise, he receives a telegram from Washington telling him he's being relieved of command. Not only that, but they court-martial him. They accuse him of cowardice. I tend to think the man had his hands full. But to give you an idea of what the fire on these ironclads look like, that's what the smokestack of the Virginia too. Ironically, the man that was in command on the Confederate side, a man named John Mitchell, he's also relieved of command. His superiors are disappointed in him that he did not pursue this attack, which honestly, this is suicidal by now. So he's relieved of command, and up until the end of the war, the fall of Richmond, he's still demanding to have his day in court, so to speak. He's just relieved of command, but has never given a reason why, and he wants to know, he wants to clear his name. So ironically, both of the commanders of this little action both end up being court-martialed. William Parker, they find him guilty of basically lack of judgment, but the Secretary of the Navy said in good conscience he could not convict a man of, it was too vague of a charge, and he set his conviction aside. Nonetheless, it ruins the man's career. So as we end towards the end of the war, Confederate line gets stretched, it breaks through here at Petersburg, and Richmond has to be abandoned. When Richmond falls, these three ironclads are up at Jury's Bluff and Chaffin's Bluff. And as they are, find my description here, as they are leaving, Confederates are obviously in confusion. The admiral who's in charge at Jury's Bluff gets word to Chesterfield Courthouse, where General Mahone is, as he's retreating from Petersburg, and basically he wants to know, what am I supposed to do? Mahone says, well, I'm not a Navy officer, but he advises him to withdraw as quickly as possible, and above, to take precautions that the enemy not be advised of your withdrawal by blowing up your magazines or other like demonstrations. Curious enough, Mahone writes, the head of my division had not reached Chester a few miles away when now the gray morning had come. Here came the terrific explosion of the magazine at Jury's Bluff. So much for getting out without making a lot of noise and letting the enemy know what you're doing. A Major Robert Stiles at Chaffin's Bluff described, the explosions began just as we got across the river. When the magazine at Chaffin's and Jury's Bluffs went off, the solid earth shuddered convulsively. But as the ironclads one after another exploded, it seemed as if the very dome of heaven would be shattered down upon us. Columns and towers and pinnacles of flame shot upward to an amazing height, from which on all sides ignited shell flew on arcs of fire and burst as if bombarding heaven. So that was the end of the ironclads on the James River. Just to wrap up here real quick, that's at Jury's Bluff. That's a piece of one of those ironclads up on the bluff there after it blew up at Jury's Bluff. If you were up at Richmond today on Chimborazo Hill looking down at Rocket's Landing, that's what it looks like today. And that's what it looked like at the end of the Civil War. And just real quick before I close, just some zooming in on that one photograph. That odd-looking ship, that's that Sputin Duvel. That's the torpedo boat that was with the Onondaga that day. You can also see a large ship still under construction there at the docks. That's what's left of the Patrick Henry, which was the Confederate Naval Academy ship. And that is what is left of the USS Texas. That's another ironclad that was being built there. And they set half of it burned up when they set it on fire, abandoning Richmond. And just to close real quick, the Onondaga, that ended up being sold to France and was in her Navy till the late 1800s. I don't know how they got that across the Atlantic Ocean without sinking. But another cool picture of this area, this is about where 295 crosses the James River now, Varina Bridge. I like that picture because of all of the variety of ships in there. And this one in particular, that's an ironclad that was made specifically to operate in these shallow inland waters. But they took the original design and altered it to add more armor. And they found, if you'll notice, there's no turret on it. They found that if they put a turret here, it'd be so heavy it would sink. So it ended up being a big crow's nest and a gun mounted on the deck. You can imagine for an ironclad, you had very little protection if you were manning that gun. but they still built 4 of these and then scrapped all of them when the war was over. And the only photograph that I know of a Confederate ironclad, that's the Atlanta, and it was captured by Union forces and put in service as a Federal warship, and it was used here in the James River. After the war, this was sold to Haiti, and while it was in transport to Haiti, it too disappeared in a storm. So somewhere out there is a Yankee submarine and a former Confederate ironclad. So again, if you want to know more about the events that happened, especially around Richmond, I highly recommend this book called Capital Navy. It's written by John Koski. He worked for the Museum of the Confederacy. Really good book and a lot more detail than what I've gone into today. So, but that's my talk. I think I might be a little over, but if you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them.
Please wait for the microphone before you ask the question. This one.
Could you give the dimensions on the pontoon bridge again? The one built by Grant?
It was 2,170 feet long.
How wide?
It was 11 feet wide. And the account I saw, they said they built it in 7 hours.
Thank you.
When did the United States first begin building steel ships? I know you said that after the war, I mean, they decided that it's not going to work anymore.
As far as I know, the Galena was probably and the Monitor were the first U.S. iron warships. I think they moved, towards an all iron fleet at the end of the Civil War. I'm not sure when we went completely, did away with the wooden ship, but certainly by the late 1800s, I don't think you're going to see any warships, wood.
There were
And then,
wooden warships in World War II that fought against magnetic mines.
yes, minesweepers were still wood. Yeah, it didn't. I don't think you saw them completely, go away. But certainly the main line ships aren't going to be, wood anymore after this.
Great talk, Scott. I just wanted to add an aside that some people may know this, some may not, that the granite outcropping at Pointed Rocks was used to build the wall around our national cemetery here in Hopewell.
Do you know anything about the digging of?
Just a minute, Dale. Nobody here. This is for other people here.
Do you know anything about the digging of the other cut-throughs on the James River?
I know most of those were done by the Corps of Engineers in the 30s. I've got some old aerial photographs from, let's see, what do you have, 1927, and you can see where some of them are dug. That's when the Dutch Gap one was widened to the extent that you see now. But yeah, I think most of them were done in the 30s.
I believe one was done in the 1880s and was sort of the Panama Canal, done by the Corps of Engineers to Panama, give them training for later the Panama Canal.
Yeah, the
But
Dutch.
I'm not
I know the Dutch Gap Canal did not become used for navigation until about that time, 1875, 1880.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they probably worked on other ones around here around that same time frame.
All right, one more question. You mentioned the CSS Virginia. So after the first Virginia was scuttled, a second one was built,
Yes,
and that was the one that was used in the warfare up and around Richmond at the end of the war.
that's the Virginia too.
Yeah, thank you.
And I forgot to mention, there is the CSS Richmond, there's still pieces of that in the river. The other two are long gone, but there's some remnants of the Richmond still out there. Okay, well, thank you. It's been great to be here.